Chapter 30. What Nightmares Thrive On, Part 2. A loud, panicked gasp marked Twilight's return to the waking world, much to her surprise. Still being in a frantic state, she bolted upright in her bed, only to be met with sharp pain in her entire body. A series of loud and pain-filled coughs ripped their way out of her in response to her hasty attempts at moving again, prompting her to look around and check the damage she had suffered. Tossing the blanket to one side with a strained flicker of her horn, she saw that most of her frame was essentially mummified in bandages. Very little of her cobalt coat showed through the slightly bloodied wrappings, and it wasn't a surprise as to why this was. The ghost of pain still lingered in most of her body, evidence of a hard-fought battle on her behalf. A few seconds of passive observation was enough to notice the slight arcane hue that danced about those wrappings. Noticeable enough, but not enough to be considered glowing. Healing magic had been embedded into the gauzes to expedite the healing process as much as possible, but there were other things on her mind. She didn't know how long she had been out, but regardless, it was enough for the adrenaline rush to wear off. It wasn't just the pain of battle that she was now keenly aware of, but the reality of what had transpired was now agonizingly clear.
Mother?
Twilight mournfully whispered out into the ether. But she didn't expect anyone to give her an answer. She had been alone from the moment she had awoken. Someone must have brought her here after the battle had concluded. But there wasn't any part of her that cared about those details right now. The scene was as clear as day in her head, and the horrid sight refused to leave the forefront of her thoughts. Neither would the sickening laughter from the assassin behind the unthinkable act. It was the only thing she could spare any effort in thinking of, and it brought her nothing but torment and tears. Someone she loved was gone, and the longer she dwelled on it, the more she came to blame herself for letting it happen. She was the first one to notice the CRN ambassadors acting strangely, and she hated herself for not acting sooner. She hated herself for not doing anything during that storm of darkness. Out of everyone in that room, Twilight was the one who should have been the most prepared for a crisis like that. She should have done something to try and stop it. It was her duty as a member of Equestria's military to protect Queen and country. And she had failed. Miserably. But it wasn't just the fact that she had been trained to act quickly in such dire circumstances. It was the fact that she was an alicorn on top of that. She spent her whole life being told that she was far stronger than other ponies, that her magic was far more potent. And yet with all of that power, she still couldn't save her mother's life. And it tore her apart inside, knowing that her failure cost someone she loved their life.
Celine?
The question brought a flash of hope to the Sorosian alicorn, who believed for just a second that her mother had somehow survived the attempt on her life. But the flash faded when it was the sight of her elder sister standing beneath the doorframe. The new Queen of Equestria stood with a weary look of mixed worry and relief, slowly walking towards the bed with painfully slow steps. Like her younger sister, Celestia II was also bandaged, though to a far lesser extent.
You're finally awake!
There was relief in her voice, her golden magic pulling up a chair so that she could sit beside her bedridden sister.
I was starting to think we had lost you as well.
Twilight grimaced at her sister's sentiment. Some part of her knew that she had meant well by it. But that didn't stop the reminder from hurting any more than it already had.
How long was I out?
She kept her sour gaze focused ahead of her. She couldn't bring herself to meet eyes with her sister after her spectacular failure. Doubly so, considering the close resemblance to their mother.
About 3 days.
Celestia responded with a grim cadence.
It's felt more like a lifetime, though, in all honesty.
3 days. The words resonated deeply within Twilight. The implications that they had, hitting harder than Sombra ever could.
And what of Sombra?
She could not bring herself to refer to that murderer as her father anymore.
Gone. Back in Ciara, if I were to guess. But that shouldn't be your concern right now. You need to rest. To recover. 3 days is rest long enough.
Twilight growled as she fought to get out of the bed, struggling not to show any outward signs of the pain that lingered in her form.
I'm going to Ciara. My father must be held accountable for his crimes. And he will, in due time. But for now, he remains out of our reach.
Celestia placed a gentle hoof on Twilight's shoulder, bringing a momentary pause to her attempts at escape.
The element wasn't the only stolen treasure. Sombra knew well what he was doing, and he used the chaos of the attack to claim everything pertaining to the tree. The element, the travel medallions, even Mother's journals. We must move forward with tact and strategy, and you need to rest. If he has stolen everything, then there's even less time to waste. We must act now!
Without even waiting for a response, she pushed past her sister's hoof and practically leapt from the bed. It caused her a great deal of pain, but she didn't let that stop her as she strode confidently as she could towards the open door. But much to her mounting irritation, a golden light was quick to seal the door shut before she was even halfway there. Angered eyes and bared fangs were quickly turned towards the Elder Alicorn.
That was not a request from your sister. That was an order from your queen. You would let him go unpunished for his treachery?
Twilight brought her horn to life with a flash of silver, ready to force her sister to stand down if need be.
This is an act of war, Tia, and I intend on bringing that war to him myself, and I won't let you—
Celestia suddenly rose from her seat, and in an instant, Twilight was reduced to little more than a mewling child. She saw nothing but fire and hatred in her older sister's eyes, and it shook her down to her very core. The silver aura around her horn ceased to be, and she had to muster up all of her will just to not cower in fear from her sister's glare.
I understand that you are upset. I am as well. And believe me when I say that I want nothing more than to reduce him to ash myself.
Celestia strode forward with all the prestige a ruler should possess, if not more. She peered down at her younger sister with authority and wrath.
But we cannot rush into this headlong without a plan. You've missed much in the past days. Already his armies have begun to act in aggression against our borders, and whatever dark pacts he has made have been extended in part to his soldiers. We're barely holding them back. The war has already begun, Celine. Right now, we need to focus our efforts on protecting Equestria and her people. On protecting the legacy that our mother left behind. And I refuse to let you kill yourself in this manner? Do I make myself clear?
Celestia ceased her lecture, allowing time for her words to sink in. The sheer weight of them would have been enough, but the fury and passion with which she had said them resonated deeply in Twilight. As it went on, Twilight started to feel more and more like a mischievous filly, like she used to be, once more being lectured by her overbearing older sister. If it weren't for the sheer and unbridled sense of intimidation she felt, she might have viewed the scenario as nostalgic. But she had nothing else on her mind other than the revelation her sister had just given her. And the more she thought it over, the more she knew her sister was right. She couldn't afford to be so careless, especially with the first hoof knowledge she had of Sombra's unprecedented magical prowess. Twilight had been humbled. It was that simple. When no response came to her question, Celestia took it as a positive affirmation. She quickly told her sibling to return to bed and rest before walking towards the door herself. But before she could leave, Twilight had one last remark of her own.
You can't stop me from fighting. You won't stop me from fighting.
Her words carried resolved defiance, yet they were still nervous and quiet. Part of her didn't want to push her sister any further away than she already had. The room fell silent as Celestia stopped. After a time, the elder sibling let out a sigh, followed by a response in a much different tone. A much kinder tone.
I know. And I don't intend to. You were the one who decided to become a soldier. That path was yours and yours alone. I don't think I need to tell you just how proud of you Mother was for taking hold of your destiny. A sentiment I share, you know.
Celestia spoke softly, turning back to face Twilight with something of a strained smile. Tears were starting to well up in her eyes.
I would not disrespect you or our mother by taking that choice away from you. I don't even think I would be able, even if I wanted to. I can't stop you from fighting in this war, Celine. I know that. But I can stop you from killing yourself. Now, please, get some rest.
Twilight was left speechless as her sister left her alone in her bedroom. There wasn't anything else she could do now. Her sister had proven with words that the order was absolute. She didn't have it in her to try and fight it anymore, and so she limped her way back to her bed. And since she no longer had to put up a brave front, she was free to wince and whine as she begrudgingly got herself back under the covers. While she had been quelled, for now, the rage and pain and guilt of everything was still just as strong as it had been. But for now, she would comply with her sister's demands and rest. The light of the setting sun piercing through Twilight's tent served to wake her in a gentle and welcoming manner. Calm mornings were an infrequent thing these days, and always welcome. Slowly but surely, she pulled herself out of her bedroll and began getting ready for the day. Still groggy and weary from sleep, Her mind lingered on the previous night's dreams. The horrid day that had begun this dreadful war was at the forefront, still clear in her mind, even after all this time. One would think that the horrendous images would at least become less vivid after 12 years. And yet still, the nightmares haunted almost every moment of sleep that came her way. But after so many years, they did bother her less. In fact, she had taught herself to use them as motivation. She had turned the pain and grief of loss into anger. Anger directed at the one who had taken her mother away from her and everything he stood for. And she had sworn on the nation that her mother had built that she would rain suffering and retribution on him if it was the last thing she ever did. It wasn't the healthiest coping mechanism, she knew that. And neither of her sisters would approve of it. But it had been years since she had seen either of them. At some point after the war began, Melodia had followed the eldest sister's lead and became Empress of the Crystal Empire, and had joined in the war against Ciara. But even with the two powerful nations working together, Sombra's forces proved more than enough to fight back against the two superior powers. It also meant she had become an alicorn, something Twilight refused to believe until she saw it. That childlike argument was one of the few bits of levity that Twilight was able to hold on to, even in these dark times. And as the all-too-familiar sounds of battle reached Twilight's ears, she sighed, as yet another reminder of the Nocturnal Nation's combative prowess had arrived. At least the time she had woken up before the raid. The memory of waking up to spears at her throat was still painfully fresh in her mind. Luckily for her, she was already almost done donning her armor for the day, and was soon on her way to join the battle with an almost bored look in her eyes. After all, this was almost a painfully dull routine by now. But such was life on the Equestrian-Ciaran border. The camp was in chaos. Equestrian and Ciaran soldiers could be seen clashing in every direction. Pegasi and Saurosians could be seen high in the sky trading strikes, while the unicorns and their nocturnal cousins exchanged powerful blasts of magic on the ground. Already, the young alicorn caught sight of casualties on both sides, and that number was only going to grow if this conflict kept going. With a resounding, guttural sigh, she strode forward into the fray, a look of barely contained rage on her face. It was at this moment that a very brave, or very stupid, Saurosian soldier attempted to strike her down. This poor fool was almost certainly filled with delusions of grandeur, wanting to be the hero who felled the immortal soldier who had been decimating the Ciaran forces wherever she roamed. The mad fool's dreams were tragically shattered as Twilight took a hold of him in her magic, not even giving him the time to scream in horror as she slammed him down into the ground. She didn't know whether or not the would-be assassin was dead, or simply too injured to rise, nor did she spare him the courtesy. The tide of this minor battle began to turn in Equestria's favor soon after Twilight's intervention. The squadron of Ciaran soldiers behind the sneak attack was clearly acting of their own accord. No commanders, no backup, and no coordination worth a damn. Likely just a bunch of drunken idiots thinking that they could raise this Equestrian war camp by themselves. Or maybe King Sombra was just that confident in his troops. I couldn't decide which explanation was more insulting, which only drove her to end this skirmish even quicker. The sun had sunken completely below the horizon by the time it was done, with the Equestrian forces victorious once again. The strike team that had begun this raid were all either dead or captured, awaiting their interrogations before being shipped off. Twilight spent the intermediate time magically licking her wounds, as well as doing what she could for her fellow soldiers, before moving on to the next task in this dark routine. She had been doing this for years now, but it was never any less sickening. One by one, the Alicorn found the names of every one of her soldiers who had been slain on this day, either by recognizing what was left of them, or by asking around to see who was missing. One by one, each of their names was scribbled into a thick, leather-bound journal. She had made it her mission to catalog every equestrian life that this war had unjustly taken, that King Sombra had unjustly taken. Their memory and their sacrifice served to further fuel Twilight's resolve in mounting her father's head upon a pike. Today, there had been 14 casualties, dwindling their numbers in the camp to just under 100, if Twilight's memory was accurate. They were going to need reinforcements soon, if they were going to keep going as scheduled. And Twilight was the one who was going to have to send the formal request back to the capital. She was the one who had to ask for more innocent ponies to march to their almost certain demise. She hated it. She hated herself for it. But she couldn't fight this war on her own. A lesson that had been forcibly learned 11 years ago. Painfully taught by King Sombra's forces and the boons that he had gifted upon certain members of his army. None of which had shown up in today's raid, much to Twilight's frustration. There was a reason why they had been waiting on the border like this, and now they had to wait even longer, with seemingly no end in sight.
Princess Selene!
An equestrian soldier frantically called out, running up with as much speed as she could. Twilight's journal slammed shut as she finished writing down the last name for the day, and her full attention was turned to the pony who had interrupted her.
They had one!
She shouted urgently through her gasps for air, clearly out of breath. For the first time today, Twilight was able to make an expression that wasn't a grim scowl.
Is it intact?
An equal amount of urgency was held in her tone. She was almost uncharacteristically hopeful that the purpose of their being stationed here was finally fulfilled.
We caught him just as he was about to use it,
the soldier explained through her still strained breaths.
The shard's intact. We've set up a quarantine as you requested.
That was all that needed to be said. Twilight quickly rushed on ahead towards the tent in question. There was an almost childlike glee in her eyes as she dashed towards her goal. For the whole of the war, King Sombra had granted his soldiers shards of his magical power to use in combat. Twilight had seen dozens of these shards thus far, and had seen the effects of hundreds more. And for as long as she could remember, she had been trying to capture one of these dark relics for herself, to try and see how they worked. And more importantly, to try and find some way to nullify and counteract Sombra's dark magic. Twilight knew she found her goal when she saw the circle of guards standing around the lone tent's perimeter, located a safe distance away from the rest of the camp in case of an unfortunate emergency. The key to the war's end was resting inside, something that filled Twilight to the brim with excitement. A sense of excitement that she had to hide as she approached the guards, quickly beginning a short series of questions to make sure everything was in order. Before going inside herself, she ordered 2 sets of her soldiers to go interrogate the pony they had taken this prize from, to get any information he had about his magical tool. By any means necessary, she made sure to emphasize. The rest of the entourage was ordered to return to the camp, to refortify their defenses and tend to the injured. As they all went on their way to complete their given assignments, Twilight entered the tent for herself. The inside was barren, save for a lone wooden table that stood ominously in the middle. Resting atop the table was the object of her desires, though one wouldn't think much of it at a moment's glance. It was a simple, poorly cut shard of onyx-colored crystal, shining gently in the dim candlelight. A few links of chain forcefully embedded into the fragment served in allowing the item to be worn like a necklace or medallion. It was not a pretty thing, but Twilight knew from experience that the magic held within was more than enough to make up for it. More times than she could count, she recalled the times where she saw a Sarosian soldier remove this makeshift amulet and crush it into dust under hoof. An act that always preceded the black tendrils of smoky magic, spewing forth from both the broken stone and at least a few nearby Sarosian soldiers, conjuring up the very same beasts that Sombra had unleashed in Canterlot Castle the day this horrible war began. Sometimes the dark magic would use broken bits of stone and rubble to construct the monstrosity. Other times the beasts would be constructed of wood. Regardless, the magic always forged constructs with the guise of wolves with piercing white eyes. Over time, the soldiers of the Equestrian and Crystal Imperial armies began calling them shadow beasts. And now Twilight had one for herself to poke and prod at, for any possible way of stopping Sombra's reign of terror. As far as she knew, all she had to do was make sure she didn't break it. Aside from that, she was free to examine the stone in any manner she saw fit. But even so, she exercised great caution, knowing full well what this thing would be capable of if its power were unleashed. Ever so gently, she plucked the shard from the table with her magic. She rotated it with narrowed eyes, casting one of many spells she knew, designed to detect and identify magical sources and their origins. It was a lengthy, concentration-based charm that couldn't be cast in the frantic midst of battle. But as Twilight finished the unique charm, she was met with a most unwelcome interruption. "Slaves," a wispy voice murmured, coming from behind Twilight. She turned to the tent's entrance to see who had chosen to bug her, but to her surprise, there was no one standing there. Curious, the young alicorn put the shard down and walked to the entrance of the tent, pushing the flap open. She peered into the dark of night for a time, the only thing she saw being the light of the campfires and torches over in camp.
"Hello?"
She asked out into the night, looking around to see if there was anyone around. But there wasn't.
"Did some pony say something?"
"We are slaves."
"You are liars."
The same voice came again, from behind Twilight. Alarmed, she turned towards the source once again, only to again see nobody there. Just the table and the shard. There was nowhere to hide in this empty tent. Yet Twilight was convinced that the impossible had been achieved as she cautiously strode back in. She took the captured relic and held it close to her chest to keep it safe.
"Hello?"
She called out again.
"Who's there? Reveal yourself, now!"
"We were summoned."
The voice came again, louder this time, seemingly coming from the dark shard embraced by Twilight's magic.
"We were stolen."
You were lying.
It was now that Twilight noticed the second voice. Her own voice, faded and distant somewhere in the deepest depths of her mind. It didn't seem like a thought, though. It felt more like the memory of a dream. And like the memory of a dream, it faded quickly from her thoughts, as if it had never happened at all. It didn't feel real.
"What are you?"
Twilight asked, placing the shard back on the table. There was no doubt in her mind that this object was speaking to her. It sounded like it was afraid, or lost. Perhaps both, even.
We can give you power,
the scared voice whispered in her ear, almost sounding like it was beginning to sing.
just as he stole power from us.
Liars!
Twilight's own faded voice called out from the back of her mind again, angrier than it was before. It sounded closer, more vivid, somehow more tangible than the rest of the world around her, almost as if reality were the dream, and the distant voice was real. The tent slowly began to distort around her, only adding further credence to this theory. But all of this was lost on Twilight as she kept her eyes on the small, dark shard sitting before her. Unable to think of anything else but the sweet songs it was singing in her ears.
We can help you kill him.
Liars!
The calamitous voice of Princess Celine was enough to rupture reality like a plane of glass, and in that instant, Twilight was flung away and made to be herself again. The memories of herself, her true self, came back to her in an instant. At the same time, the memories she had been reliving began to dull, with only a few vague details lingering in her mind. Just like the last time this happened, the lavender alicorn realized as she looked over herself. Her cloak and saddlebags were missing, but she was herself again. Her lavender coat, her purple mane, even her Pegasus-like wings, everything was how it should be. And she breathed a sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. Or so she thought. Until she saw the world around her. Just moments ago, Celine's dream had shattered, and now she stood alone in what could only be called a bleak abyss. No matter where she looked, the only sights to be seen was the blacker-than-black void that made up the sky, and the strange flat terrain that stretched out to the dark horizon. The ground was mostly smooth, with a few odd bumps here and there, made up of some unknown grayish-silver stone, with a thin layer of similarly colored dust on top. Only adding to the growing list of questions, the ground was emitting what little light there was in this unusual realm. Pale and silver, the radiance emanating from every physical surface bore a striking resemblance to something Twilight was well acquainted with by now.
Moonlight.
The muttered realization sent chills down her spine, more so than the already frigid environment did by itself. It was almost unbearably cold here, enough to allow Twilight to see her own breath in front of her nose.
Not once, but twice. Twice now you have desecrated our dreams.
1,000 voices all spoke as one, as loud as thunder, yet as subtle as a whisper.
Twice now you have desecrated our host.
Twilight spun around, only to see the cloaked figure of the Mare in the Moon standing where she had once stood moments before. The glowing white eyes under the hood still just as piercing as they had always been. She took a step back, away from the threatening figure. But the figure glided forward, matching her. Twilight continued to back away, and the Mare in the Moon continued to pursue.
You will tell us now where you learned to dreamwalk.
The mare's many voices demanded with authority, as clouds of black began to flow from underneath her cloak. The shadows twisted and manifested into something else, until Twilight was met with not one pursuer, but 3. On either side of the hooded alicorn now stood a pitch-black wolf, bearing the same white eyes as the one who had summoned them. They walked with their master at the same slow pace Twilight had set, bearing their equally dark fangs with a low, intimidating growl.
Or you shall never wake again.